And wonderful colleague who does amazing work in Ottawa, shaping young university students with respect to global health activities and doing things in an ethical and safe manner, and does amazing work internationally. Rachel Thibeault is actually an occupational health provider by her initial training, and she, I think, carries a lot of that through a lot of the work she does. She's been helping in many war zones and developing many community-based projects that are really inspiring. So it's great to have Rachel here to talk to us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here this morning, and I really want to thank you, Teresa, for accommodating me. Much appreciated. So before I get started, I just wanted to give a little bit of a background. I've been working with vulnerable populations for over 30 years, and specifically in conflict and post-conflict areas for about 20 now. I was involved in post-conflict construction in Nicaragua, Lebanon, Sierra Leone, South Africa, which was in many ways a conflict area, and I'm also still currently in Iraq. When you look at the reconstruction of civil society after conflict, most often people tend to stick to traditional means. And what do you think those traditional means would be? Any idea? Yeah, you've named quite a few frequent traditional means. One that's really common in about 20 countries is what we call the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Even Canada's got one. In fact, we've got one around the issue of residential schools, and it's still current. And most countries after conflict would ought to go for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, feeling that it's the best mode to really reestablish some kind of stable civil society. We've had them now for about 30 years in many different settings, again about 20 worldwide. And they're often kind of contrasted with what we call them the restorative Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, versus what was done after World War II, which was much more what we call the Nuremberg style of prosecution. So studies have really contrasted the two modes, trying to see what's best for a society that's gone through conflict. In fact, the most recent studies date back to only 2010. It's still fairly new, and the jury's still out on those issues. What we know so far with the current data is that the impact is much more limited than what we had hoped. And what's really significant and that we have to pay attention to is that it's the most vulnerable groups that still feel that they're left out of the equation. For example, I came back from South Africa last week, and we're looking at some of the impacts of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it's really interesting to see that the white Afrikaners, the white people of British descent, feel that it's an absolute winner in South Africa, that it solved a lot of the issues. When you speak to the colored populations, as they call them, and the Xhosa population, they still feel that their treatment is highly unfair, that the Commission has not answered their plight. So when you move into a post-conflict area or conflict area, you have to make sure that all the players have a sense of fairness. And as I mentioned, I've been in conflict and post-conflict areas for many years, several of them, and I couldn't speak about all of them, so I chose to use one example to really embody the principles of intervention in that kind of a setting. The country I've chosen is Nicaragua, because now we're about 15 years post-conflict, and we can see the longitudinal effects of what I call non-traditional means of rebuilding civil society. So when we started out, actually, the project I'm going to be describing started out in 2000. So it was just a few years after the war, and if we had taken a snapshot of what was going on in Nicaragua at the time, the contrast underneath the tension was still running very high. And something that's not paid attention to in post-conflict areas is the potential for restarting war when you don't support ex-combatants. If I look at what I've experienced in Sierra Leone when I was working with demobilized soldiers, almost all of them told me, well, we really look forward to another new war because we've got nothing now. We lost everything we had during the war. The international community has abandoned us, so we've got no means for survival, no land, no training of any kind to rebuild a life, and well, now we get fairly good money from doing war, going to war. And in several contexts, mostly from developing countries where you don't have any kind of social net, the key issue is to destabilize civil society, especially the ex-combatants, because they have a huge incentive to get the war started again. It's the way they earn a living. And so it was a bit the same problem in Nicaragua. International groups and the international community will move into a post-conflict setting to take care of health in its acute phases. We will deal with trauma, we will be right there, but as soon as the acute phases is over, everybody disappears. I've been in the field for, again, over 20 years. Not once have I seen sustainable health care provided after the acute phase was over. And that too contributes again to the falling back into a war pattern. So in Nicaragua, we had that really high tension between Contra and Sandinista. A very poor social status for ex-combatants. It's clear that when they suddenly find themselves unemployed, they fall into substance abuse, heavy drinking, violence. So in the area, the project was run and is still run in Leon, so in the northwest part of Nicaragua. The ex-combatants from both sides were seen as social nuisance. They would get drunk, they would disturb the peace, they would get into all kinds of trouble. And those local communities were not too keen on having them back, which means that they end up being marginalized and again they kind of mull over war plans and the old animosity, and they really kind of wallow into that unhealthy social climate. Also, obviously, among ex-combatants, a really high rate of disabilities, both physical and psychological. And again, as an occupational therapist, what I do is really foster all the retraining and social reinsertion of people with disabilities. And what I find extremely frustrating is that it's not something that's taken into account by the most healthcare systems. Again, everything is put on acute illnesses, conditions, and when it's time actually to do something with the burden of care and the burden of disability, we have very few means. And I just going to speak about an aside. I work also extensively with people afflicted by HIV/AIDS in places like Ethiopia, all of French-speaking West Africa, Zambia, and South Africa. And the international community is so proud to be providing a lot of antiretroviral medication, except that people don't look at two things. The first one is how many people get it over the bulk of the people having it. We've got 32 million people living with HIV/AIDS. We've got 6 million getting ARVs, which means that the remaining group really ends up with really severe disabilities, and no one speaks about that. And also, ARVs are often given even after the AIDS dementia complex has been manifested, when people have become blind and deaf and have strokes. But they get ARVs, so they won't do anything else. Officially, on the scale, they get medical care, and that's where the buck stops. Coming back to Nicaragua, so very high rate of unemployment and social unrest. And also a detail that's often overlooked. People speak a lot about rape as a weapon of war. What most people don't know is that the rate of rape increases tremendously in post-conflict. The rate of rape is much higher after the conflict than during the conflict. And it's often linked again to that social instability. Women have taken different roles when the men were at war. Men come back extremely frustrated. It's a very explosive cocktail. So again, Nicaragua followed that classic pattern, a lot of violence against women in the post-conflict era. So what do we do when we want to do something non-traditional that ultimately will tackle health issues, yes, but also will help foster a more stable civil society? First step is to find positive local leaders, people who know the issues, who can exert some influence on local stakeholders, and who will fight the good fight. The man you see on the screen is called Emmanuel. Emmanuel is now a good friend of mine. We've been working together for over 10 years. We started out as colleagues. Emmanuel is an ex-Sandinista fighter, and as you see, he's got 2 hooks instead of arms. The protocol during the war was if a Contra captured a Sandinista, they would tie the hands together, put a grenade between the hands, and detonate the grenade. A good portion of the men I work with in Nicaragua are double extremity amputees following torture. So Emmanuel represents actually the bulk of the people I started working with. What's remarkable with Emmanuel, though, he had managed to get his PTSD very much in line, and again through non-medical means. We have a whole protocol that applies to PTSD. PTSD is not linked into the medical model, it's much closer to the recovery model. And we've had excellent, results to the extent that now the Mental Health Commission of Canada is asking us to replicate. And some of it actually was piloted also through OSIS in the Canadian Forces with Stéphane Grenier, who's also a close friend. So we kind of merged all those data banks together and created a format for intervention that would rely on local resources and that would be sustainable in the long run. So Emmanuel was one of those positive leaders, and through them we do a community consultation, really extensive, really grassroots, to find what the real needs are. Again, in 30 years out there in the field, what always strikes me is the huge, it's not even a gap, it's a chasm between expert reports and grassroots realities. People make decisions around social issues, healthcare issues, cozily sitting in their offices in New York, Ottawa, or London, having no clue of what's happening out there. So when those policies get implemented in post-conflict areas, more often than not they fail, because they're totally not adapted to local context. So if you go the grassroots route, people know, they live there, they know the stakeholders, the resources, and the culture. So their first request was to get a clinic for prosthetics and orthotics. There was none in Lyon. And as you can see on the screen, one of the basic principles when we start a program is to try to be inclusive. We don't want to give a lot to ex-combatants to a point that it's going to create backlash with other populations, and you end up actually with an extra social conflict on top of everything you had before. So as you can see on the screen, it's not written that it's for ex-soldiers, it's written that it's for para servir a Nicaragua. It's for the whole population, and you will see why we really choose that inclusive format. And again, just an aside, they wanted a clinic as their first step, because after the war in Nicaragua, there was a very little known embargo that prevented the ex-Sandinista fighters to be fitted for artificial limbs in Nicaragua. It was illegal. And so Emmanuel, that you saw on the screen, actually had to leave Nicaragua illegally. Had to go and live in Bulgaria to get fitted. So now you've got a guy, an ex-Sandinista, who speaks fluent Bulgarian. Very useful. But it was his only way to get access to the health care services he needed because of that embargo. And so their first step was to make those basic services available for all ex-combatants, but also for the population as a whole. The next step we had to tackle was that whole issue of unemployment. Again, if you left ex-combatants without any work, you're really asking for trouble. And we were speaking a bit around PTSD earlier. One of the best non-medical strategies for PTSD is allowing the person to give back, to give some kind of contribution to society, to regain a sense of self-esteem. So what we did was we need to try to identify occupations that would be meaningful for the person and had a good social status. We wanted to shift the social status of ex-combatants, again, from social nuisance to full-fledged citizens who contribute to their community. But there was, again, quite a gap between the two poles, and we had to do that very gradually. So we used the clinic to do part of that process. The guy who's on the screen, Guillermo, lost a leg on a landmine and became a prosthetics and orthotics technician. So what we do actually kill 3 birds with 1 stone. We provide employment to an ex-combatant, we provide services to a society in need, and we also offer a model of good recovery, both to ex-combatants and to that child also who lost a leg on a landmine. And especially in that visit, it was interesting to see the parents bringing the child to the clinic the first time and saying, my child's life is over. My child's life will be crippled for all his life. There's no hope. And Guillermo simply lifted his pant leg and said, I'm also an amputee, and I work full-time, and I'm a citizen who does really something meaningful in society. So we really try to, again, pair the ex-combatants with positions that will have both a personal and a social impact. Obviously, we couldn't hire all the ex-combatants into the clinic, so we have to create networks where the ex-combatants will have more opportunities in terms of employment. And again, because of the social stigma, it's very difficult to find local employers who would be willing to hire them. So we started several small businesses, the first one being the Bendendorf Cafe. So the way it worked out was, on one side there's a set of computers, so the internet cafe per se, that's really manned with the ex-combatants who were in wheelchairs. I mean, we can deal with computers, there's no mobility issue. On the restaurant side, there was a whole range of different disabilities, physical disabilities, where people could still be cashier and wait at tables. And we still had some ex-combatants with PTSD issues that had been only partially resolved, and they didn't want any contact with the public, but they wanted to do something meaningful. So they are working in the kitchen. And as you might know, some of the landmines are specifically designed to blind people. They really kind of spring out of the ground with chemicals that will burn the face and render people blind. So the blind ex-combatants were retrained as massage therapists, and with the cafe there's a room for them to work. One rule I always impose when I do this kind of process, microfinance, once profits come back to the vulnerable community in sufficient amount, they have to start hiring people from their target group. So if you, again, take the example of Nicaragua, high unemployment rate all across, not only with ex-combatants in post-conflict era. So once the profits were sufficient with the cafe, 2/3 of the positions remain with people with disabilities, but they have to hire 1/3 of people without disabilities. So we start to shift the social perception, again, from social burden, ex-combatants as social burdens, to ex-combatants as very valuable employers in a community in need. And gradually, the connectedness with their own community gets rebuilt. Also, a key point, I do this kind of work in many different countries, among them, I mean, a bit in Southeast Asia, in Ethiopia, in Zambia, Nicaragua. In countries where you can find coffee producers, I always associate myself with fair trade coffee producers. For two reasons. The first one, they pay decent wages. As we speak in Nicaragua, the coffee workers for multinationals get about 30 cents a day, while the workers with the co-op, the fair trade co-op, get about $3.50. It's still not much, but it's 10 times as much, and sometimes it really makes all the difference between being able to lead a dignified life or not. So, and also with fair trade co-ops, they have an openness to social issues, and they're willing to maybe take on as employees people who still have residual symptoms of PTSD. They will be fine with that. They will create an environment that will be more adapted to their needs, and then we can create sustainable employment. Once the profits again started pouring in, the next step was to create a clinic, a workshop where they would produce locally wheelchairs and walking aids. Same format again, ex-combatants. Here you have Jose, who's got a bullet wound injury, again working at the workshop. And same format, 2/3 of people with disabilities, 1/3 of people without disabilities. Once the clinic, the workshop started making sufficient money, we wanted again to tackle that issue of violence against women, very important. So we sensitized the ex-combatants to the plight of women, and a lot of the women who have been raped and have gone through a lot of violence during and after the war have been willing to talk about their experience and meet with the ex-combatants. And as a result, some of the money now is earmarked for supporting women with residual mental health conditions. And we've created a positive bridge between the ex-combatants who no longer see the women only as objects, but were actually connected to the suffering of those women. And the way we do it, we try to bring the ex-combatants to their own notion of suffering so it can resonate to the suffering of others. And gradually, we're building bridges between those communities. Some of the money, too, is now used to include social children into the regular school system. Children with disabilities were left out, had no access to school. And when we speak again about self-esteem and having the sense that you give back to your community, the ex-combatants are really proud to go and visit the kids in school and see that these kids are getting schooled because of them, because of their work, because of what they do. And so there's a sense of pride, and again, more connectedness being created between the parents of the children with disabilities and the ex-combatants. The next step, again, when there was more money, we started a fishing program. And as you see on the screen, it was very modest initially. And anytime I start a project of that nature, we call in biologists. I wanted to make sure that we wouldn't do overfishing or fish endangered species. So from day one, we had a biologist with the process. And that too was a successful venture. Now we have a whole fleet of these boats. I mean, life has improved quite considerably. And again, 2/3 of men with disabilities, 1/3 of people who would have been unemployed otherwise. This picture might not tell much to you, but to me it means a lot. In this boat, to the left, we have Santiago. Santiago is an ex-Contra combatant who lost a leg to a landmine. At the other end, you have Alejandro. Alejandro is an ex-Sandinista fighter who went through the same torture that Emmanuel went through, so lost both arms to a grenade. And we have the two men in the same boat, literally. And how was that achieved? It's always very gradual. Do you know this man? This man is called Amin Malouf. Amin Malouf is a Lebanese essayist who's worked a lot on the question of identity. And his thesis, and I've been using it for many years and it works quite well, is that our identities are multiple and can be positive or murderous. In fact, his book has been translated in English under the title In the Name of Identity, Violence and the Need to Belong. It's an excellent, excellent book. But basically what Malouf told us is that you will not rebuild a post-conflict area unless people develop a collective identity. So what we did in Nicaragua was when we opened the clinic I showed you, when the men started coming to the clinic, very systematically, we booked the appointments for the ex-Contras and the ex-Sandinistas at the same time. We wanted them to be in the waiting room at the same time. Simply create a space where the guys would be together. I can tell you that initially it was tense, to say the least. And then when the rehab process moved on, well, maybe they would have to do the parallel bars together. We really gradually increased proximity. And the goal was to have them develop a collective identity. And that identity got developed. As they were doing their rehab together, they started talking about their families. And eventually, they all saw themselves as men in desperate need to feed their families. And that very basic human suffering, that very basic human need, eventually transcended the political identity. So what we do, once we have that connectedness, that we see that some ex-combatants can get along more than others, the next step, I come up with the microfinance scheme, which is, well, there's money for you to launch a nice fishing endeavor if you work together in the same boat. And most of them, I would say, only one in the past 10 years, only one man has rejected the offer. All the others have joined in and have chosen to work with the ex-enemy. And for those who have chosen to work together, they're very creative. Again, as soon as you give people leeway to really express their potential, it's amazing what they can do. And if you don't bring in your own baggage and impose your cultural views and expectations. So a few years ago, actually in 2006, I was back to Nicaragua, and the guys told me, well, we'd like to discuss something with you. I said, sure, what's on the table? They said, we've met with a biologist, and we've got a key problem in the area, which is the disappearance of mangroves. The mangrove is a key ecosystem for the reproduction of land and marine species. It's when the jungle kind of moves into the sea. And because of tourism in Central America, everything's been razed to the ground to make place for hotels and beaches. And it's had major consequences. One being that now hurricanes are much more devastating because the mangroves are the buffer between the winds coming from the ocean and the inland crops. And now there's no buffer left. I mean, again, we've razed everything to the ground. So the participants in the project said, well, we're going to reclaim the mangrove. And they started bringing back some of the species, the native species that had disappeared from the area, brought back clams and mussels, and nature is amazing, within just a few years, they had rebuilt 6 kilometers of mangrove. And what you see here is they've got little pathways, and it has become a site for ecotourism. So now all around this area, Poniloya, you've got bed and breakfasts coming up in restaurants and all kinds of peripheral touristic infrastructure where women participate a lot. We have earmarked some of the positions for women to make sure that gender equality is also maintained. So in a nutshell, it was really kind of the process. I wanted again to highlight the role of fair trade. A lot of it would have been possible without the connectedness, the connections with the fair trade movement. And just to say, in Canada now, buying a fair trade coffee at Bridgehead, and I've got no actions in the company, I swear, no conflict of interest, but choosing to buy fair trade coffee at Bridgehead versus regular coffee at Starbucks, again, makes no difference for our pocket. It makes a huge huge difference at the other end. And I always say that as a healthcare professional, it is my duty to put my money where my mouth is, and literally. So I want my coffee and other goods to be fair trade. So the key steps in summary of that process: we have to identify and cultivate a common identity. We have to engage in a common social project, and it was very explicit that we would rebuild that small area and the ex-combatants would do it. The work I do in Iraq now, for example, the common project is providing support for the war widows. That was really the common thread that we could find within all the groups I'm working with in Iraq. Achieving economic empowerment, you will go nowhere unless within that post-conflict area you've got sufficient resources, and unless those resources are controlled by the vulnerable groups within that area and not by external stakeholders. You have to bring people to contribute to their local community, both in terms of economic growth and in terms of personal healing. And the key is really to create new models that can be reproduced. When we force the two ex-combatants in the same boat, we really want to do something that's highly symbolic, that people see them, that it really strikes the imagination, and suddenly it opens the horizons. We present a different way to live. We present new horizons, and we show that it is possible. One of my biggest challenges is the work I do in the Palestinian camps in Lebanon, because we cannot go out of those camps because we've got a trapped population. It's very difficult to create new social models. But in a traditional post-conflict area like Nicaragua, we have that opportunity to show new ways of being. And I wanted to tell you that all of this started with the $10,000 grant. Next to nothing, the reconstruction of civil society is cheap if it's done well, and unfortunately there's next to no money ever devoted to it. And I wanted to end on a question to you. What do you think is one of my most difficult obstacles in the kind of work I do?
Raising money.
Yeah, and attached to that, in that raising of money, what is my biggest obstacle?
Talking to government officials or corporate officials.
No.
Indifference.
No.
It's who you're targeting to actually make the intervention with that may be not desirable for some of the people who might have the money to do it.
All of these are true. I mean, all of these create problems, but there's one that's even...
Being a woman?
No, that's a problem too, but it's not the main problem.
You separate the issue and yourself to working hard with the situation and to separate from this.
Sometimes it's difficult, but it's not. And I will give you a hint. When I say this, I get thrown tomatoes. And I might get some this morning.
Ethical care.
Pardon?
Ethical care.
Ethical care?
They care.
My main obstacle is actually medical lobbying. What happens when it's time to secure funds? Medical doctors carry a lot of power, and unfortunately, often the whole health issue is reduced to trauma. All the money goes into trauma. When I'm there at the table, I've got no weight, none whatsoever. I get pushed aside faster than a fly would be. And to me, it really hurts, because again, if we don't stabilize civil society, it simply means more trauma in the long run. We have to have a long-term vision. And so I have a request for you this morning. I feel that if together we could promote a vision of health that includes, but goes beyond trauma and includes civil society, social issues, I think then we could really contribute to peace. Thank you.
all understand why we felt privileged when we convinced her to come and talk to us. I have a very selfish question. Starbucks has fair trade coffee. Is that the same thing?
I've been there for a while, but it was only a few days a week, a couple of years ago. Is it regular now?
I mean, when you buy the coffee, if you buy coffee there, not a cup of coffee, I don't know if they sell it that way, but you could buy like your own grind. That's fair trade. It's the same thing.
Yeah, it's the same. If you have the logo on it, if you have the logo on it, then it's okay, because actually the regulations are very stringent. So if the logo is on the product, you can be assured that this is fair trade.
But you're still supporting a place that also supports other kinds of coffee.
Yeah.
It's best to go to just support that.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm always impressed with people from occupational therapy backgrounds and who understand, as you do, who work on the premise that people need to be reintegrated back into doing valuable work. Can you tell us again where you work and how you end up doing these projects?
It's been a strange story. I was working, actually, I was chief occupational therapist in the Northwest Territories. I lived in the Canadian Arctic for several years. And we were 5 occupational therapists for a territory the size of Europe, 100,000 people, and next to no financial means. So in despair, I called the World Health Organization and I said, help me, I don't know what to do. And they said, there is this new approach called community-based rehabilitation that we're trying out. Would you pilot it for us? And it's really kind of a training, the trainer's approach that works. I mean, I started, that was about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And we tried it up north, and the results were so good. It was actually around addictions, depression and suicide, fetal alcohol syndrome, and rheumatoid arthritis. And the programs worked really well, so WHO asked me to go and present in Geneva the results of the study. And when I went, then there were people at the UN asking me to replicate with some of the projects in French-speaking West Africa. So I went there. When I was there, the war was waging in Sierra Leone and Liberia, so I was asked to replicate in war zones. And then I was asked to do the same thing with people with HIV/AIDS and leprosy and all kinds of different issues. So my mandates come from 3 sources, the UN or UN implementing agencies, local or international NGOs, and more and more simply grassroots people. Like in Zambia, 2 years ago, 40 women with disabilities secondary to HIV/AIDS show up on my doorstep. I always live with families in the slums, in the context. So they show up one morning and they say, we've heard about you, we are women with HIV/AIDS disabilities, we're beggars, we want to have a dignified life, can you help us? So we started the same process with them. They're off the street and they run their own businesses. And most of it now comes just like that through the grapevine, and I love it.